Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett at Launch Academy, here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. Today is going to be very exciting. We're going to put all this work together that we've been working on throughout 13 episodes, and we're going to munge it all together and scrunch it all together and actually build a project of consequence. So we've kind of been hacking around this kind of goofy page. We're actually going to start to use a professional design and start to incorporate that into what is going to be the online equivalent of your resume. So let me ask you a question. Did you get your resume together? Your resume should be together. You should have it ready to rock with us as we roll into this project. And what we're going to do along the way is we're going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the career services type of things that we're able to offer here through our Launch Academy online and on-campus programs. So you get a little taste of the Launch Academy Career Services experience as we dive into putting all this material together. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to plan out this new HTML project, get it set up, and we're going to also identify resources for design inspiration, get you inspired. I'm not a designer myself, so I need to go out to the web and get some design inspiration and perhaps even a template to help me get started. Then we're going to incorporate some icons and iconography into our designs using an amazing third-party library that I'm excited to share with you. And we're going to begin the construction of our new responsive resume. And this episode is likely going to be one of a series of episodes as we work through this project. And then we have another design-oriented project where you're going to help us build the landing page for this very show. So stick with us. It's going to be very hands-on, sort of learn as you go, learn through doing, and follow along with me as we work through. All right, so what are we going to be doing? Well, essentially, I'm going to take one of our example resumes here, and we're going to create an online equivalent of it. And this is a resume that our career services team has put together here at Launch Academy, and we give this to our online students as a way for them to understand what are the important elements of their resume. And because we're a project-driven and technology-oriented program, we really focus on highlighting the technical skills in projects first as part of your overall resume. And you may be asking, why the heck do we need a resume? We're in tech. Believe it or not, when and if you decide to look for a career in technology, recruiters are going to be looking for a resume, hiring managers still use it, so it's totally something that you want to have at the ready, and you want it looking professional and in line with your experience. So we really focus on the structure of this resume as part of the overall career services experience here at Launch Academy. So if you join one of our programs, we've got a dedicated team that will help you put your best foot forward in the job search. And that's one of the things that we're really well known for. We've got an amazing team here. If you want to learn more about that, shoot me a direct message in the Slack channel or shoot us a note via email at hello@launchacademy.com if you're not yet in the Slack channel. And moving into this project-based curriculum, I want you to ask questions. Let's make this interactive. So if you're not yet in the Slack channel, I recommend you go ahead and join. Spencer will put the link to the sign up in the Facebook feed. And I'm just going to move on here, but keep the questions going, keep the questions flowing, continuing on with the pattern that we've established in previous episodes. Awesome. So notice that we've got technical skills listed out first, and then we have featured project work, or the sort of the coding that you've done as part of a Launch Academy online participant. And then we talk about what we call your previous amazing life. And that's your professional experience, your work experience prior to being a student at Launch Academy or Launch Academy Online. And then we also have you list out your education. And we're very much a stickler on having this resume sort of span one page. It makes it easier for hiring managers to review. And you may have heard the expression or the quote, I would have written a shorter letter if only I had more time. So being as concise and abridged as possible actually aids you in the job search and makes you less likely to be discarded because your information can't fit on one page. So really important, try to condense that into one page. But for the purposes of the web design and the web development that we're doing here, the page stuff doesn't matter, and we can actually be a little more creative aesthetically as we work through this problem. So one thing that I always do when I have something that I want to put online is, I'm not a designer, I really need to get some design inspiration. I really need to get out there in the world and determine, okay, what are the things that designers are doing that's creative, that's conveying this information in an aesthetically pleasing way. So how do we get design inspiration? Well, thankfully, there's amazing resources on the web. So we can go to sites like Dribbble, which actually has 3 B's in it. And that's kind of where graphic designers hang out nowadays at the time of this recording. And you can get lots of design inspiration here. And it has a nice search bar, so you can get design inspiration about specific things if you want. In fact, if we search resume, what comes up here? You could get design inspiration from some of these ideas and some of these aesthetics. One thing that you should be very careful to do on the web, particularly creatively, is don't just blatantly rip people off, right? Use these designs and these themes as an inspiration, right? And take some creative latitudes and make some changes and make it your own. People really don't like to be totally ripped off without credit on the web. So if you use one of these, either pay homage to the person that inspired you, or really kind of radically change it so that you make it your own original kind of perspective. So Dribbble is great, and again, that's with 3 B's. Behance is also a kind of another place at which designers hang out. And lastly, you can kind of just Google, if for example, we could Google best online resumes design. And there's a lot of these websites that kind of aggregate top 10 lists and top 20 lists and things like that. So you can actually search through some of these initial search results and see if anything speaks to you in that regard as well. But the last one I want to talk about that I'm most excited about, and I think is most applicable for where you all are in your learning of HTML and CSS, is there's this wonderful site called ThemeForest. And ThemeForest basically is a set of prepackaged themes that are already HTMLified and CSSified, so you can take it and manipulate it and make it your own. In fact, I found the design inspiration that we're going to use for the responsive resume through ThemeForest. And you can actually just click on something and actually just purchase it. And definitely keep an eye on the reviews and what people have to say about it. But essentially, you can get access to the Photoshop files, the HTML files, the CSS files, and any images incorporated as part of the theme. You essentially buy access to that theme. So it's a super handy site if you're not a designer, if you're not creative, to not only get some design inspiration, but to get a nice baseline and a starting point for the work that you are setting out to do. So those are a couple ways you can get design inspiration. And what I shared with you is that I found this particular template through ThemeForest, and we're going to take this and make it our own. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to pick a color theme with Adobe Color and modify and manipulate this particular rendering to reflect what we want to accomplish from the sample resume here. So we're not going to actually download the theme from ThemeForest, though that's an option for you if you'd like. We're going to use this as design inspiration, and we're going to write our own markup to make this project our own and to go through that process of HTMLifying and CSS, applying CSS to our web projects. Cool. All right. So how are we going to tackle this beast? In fact, you may be like, I don't even know where to start. And that's a frequent question that we get when students are starting out with us in either Launch Academy Online or Launch Academy here on campus. So what we want to do is we want to approach our design first by kind of constraining where we're going to start from a medium standpoint, right? So we're going to incorporate what we call a mobile-first design as part of our practice here. We're going to eliminate the sort of the variability of handling for a desktop display like I'm showing here, a tablet display like you may see at a resolution, say, something like this, and a mobile design, right, based on the relative width of our available screen size. We're going to start at this viewpoint. We're going to start at this mobile first perspective, and we're not going to worry about the larger resolutions until we get deeper into the project. So what are we going to do? How are we going to accomplish this, even from the perspective of taking a mobile first approach? Well, we want to essentially plan this approach out with what I like to call chunking. We're going to decompose the problem section by section, so we can kind of carve out each of the aesthetic areas of the site and kind of say, okay, chapter 1 is going to be these social media icons. That might be difficult to see, but they're a subtle gray in the current background. And then we'll tackle the profile section. And even in the profile section, we're going to subdivide or decompose that problem to determine how we're going to display the resume name and the sort of the role that they want to play in prospective companies. And then all the contact information and how to get in touch with that individual. And then the paragraph around the description. And we'll follow that process with each chunk one by one as we work through each component of our responsive resume. And then when we're finally done, we'll move to the tablet form and optimize for the tablet form and change our responsive design to reflect any changes that we need to make there. And then we'll look at sort of the wide display or the desktop display and identify any changes that we'll make there. But the key is to start with that mobile first design. We're optimizing for a mobile experience because that's a predominantly used medium nowadays. So we're starting there and we're going to expand our viewport outward. And if all of this is unfamiliar to you, or this idea of responsive design and mobile first design is unfamiliar or vague for you, go back to our last episode, episode 13, where we talk about responsive design in the fundamentals of kind of conditional style sheets and media queries. Awesome. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this particular window here. I'm going to close out the Envato Market frame there. And I'm going to incorporate that mobile view tool that we covered in last week's episode. And what we're going to do is we'll just set it to a galaxy for right now. And I'm going to actually set the zoom higher so you can benefit from that perspective. And we're just going to decompose the problem. But before we can even, divide, start to decompose the problem, what we have to do first is we have to determine our starting point. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in HTML5 boilerplate. We're going to bring that in. We're going to pick a color scheme, and we're going to document those color schemes. And we're going to start to apply our own interpretation of this design inspiration. And that's how we're going to round out today's episode. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to actually separate the inspector into a separate window. Yeah, that's better. I like that. All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get the latest version of the HTML5 boilerplate, and I'm going to incorporate it into our library. I'm going to open it up. Copy and paste all of the files into my folder for this episode. And I'm also going to get set up with MAMP so that I can view this like we would in production. And if you're not familiar with MAMP, you want to roll back to some of our earlier episodes in terms of getting set up like a professional developer in your local development environment. And I'm going to point MAMP to episode 14. And I'm going to start MAMP up. So all of this up until this point should be somewhat review and somewhat familiar to you. All right, MAMP is running. And we've got our HTML5 boilerplate loaded up. All right, cool. So we've got our baseline for starting the project. And what we want to do now is we want to start to think about how we're going to apply this aesthetic to our current website. Well, to do it first and to make it our own, I'm actually going to use color.adobe.com or Adobe Color CC, which is a freely available tool that I think we've alluded to in the past, that basically gives us the ability to specify a theme that is aesthetically pleasing to us. And what I've done here is I've pre-selected a compound color scheme that I thought spoke to me, and I'm going to use this in the context of my interpretation of this theme. So, okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this gray potentially as a background color, though I don't know. I think actually I'm going to use a white background color. And I'm going to use some of these other colors as highlight colors, maybe as some of the buttons that we've incorporated here. We'll use some of those colors, and maybe we'll use it for our title and our role. And I'm just trying to think about how I'm going to apply these colors to this design inspiration that we've decided to apply to, right? So I'm just getting the noggin going in terms of how I'm going to use these colors in the context of this particular template. And we may change it up, we may play with things as we go, and that's one of the things that you have to be comfortable with when you're going through this web development and web design process. Now, sometimes, and in fact most of the time, if you're working in a team environment, somebody will give you these designs and give you the preconceived ideas around color, and somebody that's more qualified from a graphic design perspective is going to give you a little bit more detail on how they want this to look and feel. And when we go into our next project, where we design a landing page for this very series, you're going to be given those constraints, and we're going to work within those constraints. But for now, we thought it would be cooler, given it's your personal resume, to kind of take a little bit of creative latitude with what they've provided here. So it's going to be a little bit of an iterative process. We're going to mess around with some colors, mess around with the design, and achieve an aesthetic that we're happy with. All right. So again, we're starting with this mobile first presence. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get set up with our sort of baseline experience. And I'm going to turn on the mobile view here in the same way. And we are going to start our work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to incorporate these colors, and I'm going to give them a name in my CSS document so that I can easily reference them. So I have the color scheme selected. Now I want to bring these colors into CSS so that I can use them as I start to set up my document. So I've already got our project open here. So I'm going to create a new CSS file to separate out our styling from everything that HTML5 boilerplate has supplied. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to say style.css, and I'm going to begin to document the colors in a comment. So I'm going to call this we'll call this gold. Trying to think of how we might disambiguate this color from this color. I'm going to have this be gold, and then light gold is how I'm going to disambiguate. All right, so I'm going to take these hex codes, and I'm just going to document them in the context of my library here. And this just gives me a handy dandy reference of all the hex codes for the color theme that I'm using. So think of it like kind of setting your color palette and kind of putting the paints at on your palette. And we're going to call that light gold for now. And we'll call this light blue. And we'll call this one Aqua. All right, so we've got all the colors. And what we want to do now is we want to make sure we're incorporating this CSS document into our index. So we're going to do that using an external style sheet. And if you remember, because we're using MAMP, we want to actually make all of these references to be absolute paths and not relative paths. And we'll do the same for our JavaScript references. And we've got a pretty good baseline here. And just refresh the page and make sure we're good. The other thing that I want to do is I want to actually validate my local HTML to determine that I'm at a good place. So remembering from the web standards material that we covered in a previous episode, we can validate this HTML using that validate local HTML field. And we've got some work to do, as you can already see. So it's always good to kind of get a sanity check before you start to apply your styling. So that's what we're going to do here. So it looks like I'm missing a tag here. That was a clumsy typo. So let's refresh the page and validate our CSS again. So this is the Web Developer Toolbar, an extension I recommended earlier in the course. We got to fill in the title and then we should be good. So the W3C validator is telling me everything I need to do to be working with valid markup. I validate again. And we're good. All right, so we're ready to start thinking about our first chunk, which we have identified in the mobile view as these really subtle icons. They may be actually very hard for you to see, but they are really, really subtle icons that represent your social media. So we're gonna go ahead and incorporate those. And often what happens when you're dealing with web design is we're going to have to incorporate third-party libraries and images to kind of reflect some of the creative things that we want to do from a web design and aesthetic standpoint. Well, thankfully, we have an awesome library at our disposal thanks to the wonderful world of open source. And that library is called FontAwesome, and it's located at fontawesome.io. And what it does is provides you with a set of available icons that you can incorporate as part of your overall design. We're going to use FontAwesome in the context of our current project so that we can kind of have some of the headlines that is displayed in this subtle item over here, right? So in order to actually actualize this particular view and rendering of the resume, we have to incorporate FontAwesome first. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're decomposing the problem. This is the problem in front of us. We've got to incorporate a third-party library. We go to FontAwesome to get the answers. And why do we use FontAwesome for iconography? Well, the answer is that A, it's freely available and liberally licensed, which is super important in the open source world. But we like using fonts for icons in modern web design because icons in fonts are vector-based. So what that means is, as I increase the text size of my web browser, the icon itself still looks sharp and clean. If we were using things like a GIF or even a JPEG, as we increase the size of the icon, it would start to look grainy and it would look low in resolution. So we like fonts and using fonts for icons because it can be responsive and adaptive to the size of the font incorporated in the document. So we're going to use FontAwesome. And wonderful libraries like FontAwesome have a getting started guide that tell you exactly how to make this happen. And what we're going to do is we're going to download and customize it because we don't want to rely on a third party. Remember everything that we talked about in terms of eliminating points of failure in some of our earlier discussions. So we're going to download this library and we're going to incorporate it using CSS. So we're going to follow this set of instructions to get Font Awesome rolling in our library. So I'm going to go ahead and download it. All right. And we've got the CSS fonts located here. So what we're going to do is we're going to deviate a little bit from the instructions here, and we're just going to copy the CSS and fonts. Now, if you're reading through this document, you could follow along with these instructions and do just fine. You'd get the functionality that you're looking for. But because we want to be organized and we kind of want to observe our own file system structure, we're going to make some tweaks, and I'm going to walk you through that. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the Font Awesome CSS, and we are going to take that, and we are going to create a new folder in our CSS document, CSS folder. Let me actually just do that in the project window so that it's a little more clear. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm actually going to call it vendor because we're incorporating a third-party library. And I'm going to take this Font Awesome CSS, and I'm going to put it in that vendor directory. And then I'm also going to create a fonts directory to store the fonts that make up the iconography for Font Awesome. And we didn't cover it, but essentially what Font Awesome does is it takes advantage of the font face style sheet rule. And the font face basically allows us to apply a font to our document in a way that makes sense. And what we need to do is we need to reference these special files that contain the vectors, the font itself, so that we can incorporate them into the document. So we have to update some of our references here. We're gonna do that. I'm gonna create a vendor directory in my fonts, and I'm gonna move all of the fonts, all of the files. This is super important. Copy all the files in the fonts directory over to this new vendor directory that I created. Okay? And then we're gonna update these path references for the font face to reflect this new file structure that I've shared. So we're gonna go down to directory, and then we're gonna go to fonts. This actually looks pretty, well, we have to account for the vendor directory, so we need to go up 2 directories. So we go up from vendor, up from CSS, and down into the fonts directory, and then into vendor. So I'm just going in here and updating all of these references to reflect the path that we want. And we could either use a relative or absolute path if we wanted to. I modified these to reflect that kind of windy, if you will, relative path. I actually prefer using an absolute path, so we'll just do that. All right. All right, so that's all the customization that we really need to do to begin using the library. So we're ready to go onward with the tutorial. We're using straight up CSS, so this section is irrelevant to us. And then we can start to look at how these icons actually work. So if we go to the examples, for example, maybe we want to show this camera retro. Well, it gives us the markup that we would need to incorporate into our HTML document. So we can go ahead and use these special classes as a way to do so. So we're just going to make a test that essentially tells us that Font Awesome is working correctly. And we need to also reference the style sheet that we incorporated as part of our library here. And I'm going to put it above. And if all is well, we should see a camera. Let's see if it does the trick. And it doesn't. Let's see what else we might be missing. We've got our reference to CSS vendor fontawesome.css. That points to absolute paths for our fonts, vendor, font awesome. So all this looks good to me. Make sure there aren't external references. There shouldn't be. Okay. CSS vendor fontawesome.css. That all looks good. So what's going on? Break out of responsive mode just for right now. And let's see what happens in console. Do we get any error messages? We don't. If we inspect the element, we see the I tag itself. And it should have an image in it. So we can use the Chrome inspector here to help us debug what's going on. And it doesn't look like it is applying the Font Awesome stylings that we expected it to. So let's find out what's going on in our style sheet. Everything looks good there. We've got the reference to Font Awesome. We've got our FA. So this should be working. Let's put it in its own paragraph. And it looks like the styling for that particular Font Awesome tag is not being applied. So what we should see are style sheet rules that are coming from this Font Awesome CSS that is giving us additional styling rules here. But notice that there's no reference to the Font Awesome library that we just incorporated. So there's probably something going on with the incorporating that CSS. So let's inspect the head here and make sure that we're appropriately referencing the Font Awesome file. Ah, see here? I've got a typo. Herf instead of href. Very sloppy. But that was just a wonderful example of how to debug CSS related issues. So I fixed that href. We refresh the page and there's our camera. Awesome. All right, so we're halfway home. And what we want to do is we want to reflect the icons that we want to reflect in our resume. So I'm gonna reference here the resume that we have, and we want to incorporate LinkedIn and GitHub. And I'd also recommend pointing potentially to Twitter or Facebook, provided that those social media profiles are work appropriate. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And how do we know what icons are available to us from Font Awesome? Well, thankfully, actually, they list out all the icons on their webpage. And we can actually scroll through all of them and find icons that we're looking for. And because this is such a common use case, we can actually see that they've already supplied GitHub related icons. I believe LinkedIn is here as well, as is Facebook and Twitter. So We're going to incorporate those icons as part of our design. So we're going to UL, we want to make these an unordered list of social media profiles, right? So I might even qualify that in my markup. Remember that we want to describe the structure as well as the aesthetics of our HTML document. So I'm going to use this convention that Font Awesome has given us, where we're going to apply the CSS class of FA, and then we're going to also apply the given name to that particular icon, which is GitHub. So we're going to do FA-GitHub here. And if all is well, I'll see a little bulleted list with just the icon for GitHub on my webpage. Good, okay, and we want to actually make that a link, right? So we're gonna href to my GitHub profile. And just think about readability here, just kind of reformatting my markup. And that link seems to be working. Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna follow suit for our LinkedIn profile. I forget my LinkedIn profile, so I need to look that up. Oh boy, okay, here's my profile. And this is the handy dandy URL for my LinkedIn profile. So I'm gonna take that and copy that. And I'm going to use the same markup that Font Awesome provided, but I'm going to use a LinkedIn indicator for this particular icon. So I can search for it here on the Font Awesome website. And I'm going to use the background list icon here for just FA LinkedIn. So we'll go ahead and do that. And this needs to be its own separate list item. Refresh the page, keep that feedback loop nice and tight. And that's pointing to the right place. All right, and I'm deciding, and it's up to you, whether you want to incorporate your Twitter or Facebook account. I tend to try to keep my Facebook account personal, so I don't really see business value in incorporating it into my resume. However, I use Twitter professionally. So another thing that we talk about in career services is how to manage your social media presence. That's how I choose to manage my social media presence. So I'm just going to list my Twitter here. But feel free to incorporate your Facebook account as well if you want. And I happen to know that that's the class. But again, you could consult the documentation and the icon listing on the Font Awesome website. And so let's refresh the page. Not LinkedIn. All right. So we've got our Twitter icon, our LinkedIn icon, and our GitHub icon. And notice how first I wanted to just get the structure of the document right first, right? We know that this, in fact, is the aesthetic that we want, that really vague, grayed out set of icons, right? But I'm not focused on that first. As I start to decompose the problem, I'm focusing first on the semantics and the nature of the data that I'm trying to convey. And this is just a list, and an unordered list at that, of all of my social media profiles. So I'm deciding that I'm going to put them in an unordered list. Now what I can do is I can start, now that my markup is appropriate, now I can start to think about how I want to match that aesthetic perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to modify the way that this unordered list displays. So I'm going to go into my style document, and I'm going to use a CSS selector to isolate my social media profile list items. So we use this class, social media profiles. And we're going to say that we want to display these as an inline block. And I think it's list style. We're going to say none. And let's see how that affects our aesthetic. Now they're showing up side by side, which is great. Awesome. Okay. And we don't appear to have any kind of padding or margin issues, except for the unordered list itself. See how the unordered list is incorporating some somewhat unnecessary margin and padding, and that's coming from the default style sheet. So we want to make sure that we kind of override that user agent style sheet so that we're not dealing with unnecessary margin and padding. So we're going to set the padding to 0, and we're going to set the margin to let's say 20 px on top and bottom, and then nothing on left and right. Let's see how that looks. And this is the process of modern web development, is making these small tweaks and kind of seeing how that affects your design or your markup and your aesthetic as it pertains to the design aesthetic that we're trying to achieve here. So I've still got a little bit of work to do. I want to change the color. So we actually need to affect that change on the anchor tag. And what I'm going to actually say is, no, we'll change the color to that light gray. And there we go. We've got our first chunk kind of nicely completed. Now notice that if we're comparing our aesthetic to the design here, it looks like through our mobile design, if you notice the white space or the black space between the border of our viewport and the content that we're actually displaying, we're actually kind of boxing everything in. So one additional thing we might want to do is actually set that so that we're not really bleeding off the edge of the screen as we're displaying here. So what we're going to do is we can do one of two things. We can set a margin on the body tag, or we can declare a container class that's going to essentially contain all of the material that we've built to date. I think for now, and one of the things that we always try to aspire to do as developers is to do the simplest thing that works. Code is a very dynamic, fluid thing. We can change it at any time. So for me right now, I'm thinking all we need to do is set some margin on the body. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And we should probably make this more of a responsive thing rather than using a pixel-based unit. So we're going to set the margin to 1 rem and 1 rem. See if that's too much. So the shorthand for that is just 1 rem. See how that affects things. That's actually pretty good. So see the change? And if you inspect the element and you go to the body tag, you can see the 1 rem border that we've incorporated as part of our HTML document. All right, so we're done with our first chunk. And though our page isn't quite pretty just yet, we're on a good track to continue working through the rest of our project. And that's what we'll do in our next episode. So I hope you'll join us then. I'll see you on Thursday for episode 15 as we continue to work through these responsive resumes. In the meantime, I hope you get started. Show us some design inspiration and some things that you really enjoy on the web and how you're incorporating that into your responsive resume. Awesome. Hope to see you in the Slack chat. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.